What's up, guys? My name is Fari, and I build systems that remove bottlenecks within businesses. And I've been documenting my builds for 126 days now, going all the way up to 365. And in today's video, we're going to be going through the invisible work that builds the visible results. We're going to be peeling back the layers, as always, going through the problem layer, the core insight layer, the mechanism layer, and as well as the outcome layer. So, first things first, we can take a look at the problem layer, where we basically see that most people only see the output. They see the videos, the systems, the wins. What they don't see is the invisible layer behind it all. And what this basically means is that they don't see the invisible layer that ultimately powers every single thing that is a result visibly. The things that people see. They don't see the 2 a.m. debugging sessions, the frameworks that never saw the light of day, or the countless iterations that didn't make the final cut. And trust me, there are a ton of these. And I think that is where, in my experience, where all the leverage has been created for me personally, where no one ever really truly sees what goes on the back end. And that is where all the victories are fought and won as well, before you can then show them publicly as well. Because if you're then able to win those victories by focusing inwards, then you're then able to have a better result on the results that you ultimately show outwards. And this has been one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately, in terms of how or what is the process that ultimately goes into the back end, what people don't see, that ultimately plays into the things that people do see. And how can I constantly refine this specific process in order to make sure that when I'm then displaying the results, the wins, whatever the case may be, that it is the best that it possibly can be, but also understanding that I need to focus a lot more inwards in terms of what I'm building, the process, the thinking modes as well, and ultimately creating value and leverage through that. Because the mistake is that thinking the process only happens when people see it, but the real compounding happens when no one is watching. And when no one is watching is the point of time when I've seen it to be super boring. Everyone thinks that the flashy things all come from doing all these flashy things and all these fancy things that seem complicated on all that, whatever the case may be. But ultimately that comes, all those results and all those things come from doing the boring work each and every single day, recording the videos that I ultimately have to scrape because I can have problems in terms of recording. And that simply just happened just now, believe it or not, when I was recording this video and I got all the way to the end, and then I realized, oh, it wasn't really recording the screen as well. And that is ultimately what happens when you're focusing on the things that happen, that people don't see. You only see the result of, hey, this specific person got to this specific stage, but you don't see the countless hours that they spend building themselves and building their business as well, that ultimately allowed them to then produce the results that they've been able to produce. And that has ultimately allowed me to ask the questions of, hey, how can I focus a lot more inwards so that I can build myself and build what I'm doing to be the sharpest, and also to be the best I possibly can be in that moment in time, so that when I do present the results, that they're the best that they can possibly be as well. And focusing a lot more on the inwards things that I ultimately need to do, and the insights that I ultimately need to gain as well, which ultimately comes as a result of realizing that the invisible work is what builds inevitable momentum. It's thinking, testing, mapping long before launch day. It's not always, hey, we're gonna launch today and that is gonna, that is where all the magic is gonna happen. No, it's all in the process, in the planning, in the terms of thinking and mapping out of how are we gonna launch this specific product, which is systems, like I mentioned in my previous video, where systems are just this never ending loop of feedback loops, also iterations as well. How are we ultimately going to make sure that we're building the thinking mode in terms of the mapping out? Are we ultimately building out this product in the manner that we should be? What are the failures that we're having, and are we documenting these failures as well? Ultimately understanding that these are the insights that we ultimately gain from this, from understanding that the invisible work ultimately builds the inevitable momentum. And this ultimately results in understanding that, hey, all the things that we want to build don't necessarily have to be on the end result. We can focus a lot more on the inputs that we have to do on a day to day, and those will ultimately get us the results that we're seeking. Because each and every single day that we're fighting these battles that we're fighting are mostly inwards. They're not necessarily in the final product, but in how the final products get constructed, and that is where we need to win the battle before we even think about winning it in the results, in showing off the results. And this is ultimately allowed me to then understand, this loop cycle, that hey, the back end is the real product, the real systems that ultimately are a never ending loop of continuous feedback iterations that ultimately need to be, catered with in a certain way. And the interface, and also understanding that the interface only reflects the depth of your systems. The deeper you go, the more you can build these systems and build the result as well. And that's why I'm such a big believer in terms of going deeper than anyone else, because the deeper you go in terms of understanding and depth and quality, the better you can produce your results. And that ultimately allows you to win a lot further than someone that only took a surface level look and ultimately built a service level, or had a service level approach that ultimately gave them a service level result. How can we then go deeper than anyone else, but also understand that, this means that we're building consistency that compounds invisibly, understanding that the results that we don't see today will be the foundation that ultimately solidifies the future. And how can we, focus less on getting the end result, but rather how can we consistently compound on the things that ultimately build the foundation that we ultimately want to strive for. And I think this is ultimately, a byproduct of fully understanding that, hey, the systems and the things that you ultimately build are a byproduct of the process and the things that you've failed, you've learned and also improved on. And also understanding that silence is also leverage in terms of, the less noise that you're then able to chase, the more signal you then build. Focusing on signal over noise is one of my approaches that I ultimately like to focus on. What are the things that are ultimately, producing more signal rather than noise, not chasing the flashy things or shiny object syndrome? And how can I constantly use that approach in order to build better products, better systems, if you will? Because these are going to be continuous, they're going to require continuous iterations, where we're going to have to, make do on things that, we may have gotten wrong in the beginning, but making sure that we're also iterating so that we can build that into the future. And that comes from a lot of, different things, of understanding that, hey, the back end is the real product. That's where we need to spend most of our time and energy, in the mapping, in the planning process, and in the thinking, because that ultimately fuels how the final end product is going to be. And that is where we need to win the battles. If we need to win the battles on any front, it has to be where the invisible victories or the invisible work is done, because simply through then we're then able to build these results that everyone can see visibly. And through that, also understanding that there are different mechanisms that we ultimately need to make sure that we're pulling. And this is how I structure my invisible work, by having daily refinement cycles where I have micro tweaks on flows and automations. These can be tweaks based off of documentation that I may have done. So saying, hey, each and every single day I write down, hey, I've done this today, this worked, this didn't work, and now this is how I'm going to tweak it going into tomorrow. And just ultimately focusing on how can I have these shorter feedback cycles in terms of refinement, so making them daily, in terms of making sure that each and every single day I'm building myself and not delaying it for say a week and saying, hey, let's have a weekly refinement cycle only, but how can we have a shorter time period so that we can make sure that we're implementing things that we need to implement on a day-to-day. So if I fail something today, I need to make sure that tomorrow I'm perfecting it, so that into the next day that momentum ultimately builds, so that when we're building momentum, we're building it in a positive direction. And also understanding systems journaling is also as important in terms of tracking the mental models and process learnings that I'm learning on a day-to-day. What are the mental models that I'm implementing, and how are they servicing to the things that I am building today and also into the future? Are they actively producing more results or not? And how do we and how do we constantly also refine this process as well, and understanding that delayed exposure also plays a role in this. And this means that I only show builds when they're stabilized rather than showing them too early, because then they can ultimately not work in the way that we've intended, but ultimately getting them to a stage that, hey, we feel confident that this will work not only just now but into the future, because we've analyzed it, we've gathered these different data points, and through these different data points we're then able to feel confident enough to then say, hey, we're going to show the system now because we believe that this system is refined enough and it's stabilized as well. And also feedback loops, that I'm such a big proponent of continuous improvement and not just seeking validation. What is the truth? What is the source of truth? And how do we get closer to the source of truth and also build on the foundation of that source of truth, so that each and every single day we're just compounding the invisible work that we need to do that ultimately gets us the results that we need to get. And also understanding that through this ultimately allows the structure to keep my focus internal on compounding depth and not chasing applause. How can I constantly chase, or how can I constantly chase depth and creating so much depth that ultimately allows us to create depth in our final end product, which is the results that everyone else sees? How can we just focus on the small things that ultimately allow us to then build this visible result that ultimately gives us the leverage or the leeway in order to get to the end result, but also make sure that we're constantly building in a positive direction as well, which ultimately gets us the results that we're looking for, which is the visible success, which is the clean dashboards, the optimized flows, which are ultimately a reflection of the thousands of invisible hours in the back end, the thousands of times I've had to record a video and it ultimately did not work, or for example I had to discard it, just like I said in the beginning. And also understanding the different systems that we may have tried, the processes that we've worked or implemented for a short period of time, and then we realize, hey, this is not working, now we're gonna have to delete it. All of this makes sure that the deeper you go inward on your systems, your craft, and your discipline, the more outward your leverage becomes. The more deeper and deeper you go in terms of inward, internally as well, in terms of your systems and also whatever you're working on, the more your outward leverage will become. And how can you focus a lot more on that, inward things that you have, and also building that before you build the outward projection of what it is that you're doing. Reverse engineering and focusing how you can focus on what it is that you need to do to get that final result more than you need to do on the final result. And that's how I'm building from the unseen outwards. If I can focus a lot more on building the things that need to be built internally so that we can make sure that we're super dialed in terms of our output, then the output becomes much simpler in my opinion and my experience, that it's not always focusing on the output, on how the output should be. What are the inputs that you're putting in that ultimately take your inputs and get it to the outputs? How are you constantly spending more time and energy in that, and ultimately making sure that you super dialing that in, and also just making sure that you personally are also taking that approach of focusing a lot more inward, so that the outward result can be a display of that inward progress and inward efforts that you've made. It's 80% preparation and 20% the work, and that is the moat or the final takeaway that I would like for you guys to have in this video. That it's always the beginning, the things that you put in, the work that you put in, that ultimately gets those results. And how can you then create the leverage through that? You then ask the questions that ultimately allow you to focus a lot more on the invisible things that you compound, that ultimately produce the visible results. And this is my take on it. And I know we're gonna fail so many times, still getting super deep and learning each and every single day to refine the process, as it always is. It's not always perfect, but you always have to keep refining the process and just getting a lot deeper each and every single day. And yeah, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to check out my newsletter that I recently just rolled out. I have my first post up, so you guys should subscribe to that to see what that is all about. The links are in the description, as well as my X, LinkedIn, Instagram if you want to connect with me. And I will see you guys in the next video.